The bell above the pawnbroker's door rang softly, and Elinor Hartley prayed it would not wake the sleeping city to her shame. She had chosen the hour with care. 6:30 in the morning, when the fog still clung to the cobbles of Fenwick Lane, and the only witnesses were a milk cart and a stray cat picking at fish bones. No one who mattered would see a gentlewoman standing at a counter meant for desperate men and ruined widows. No one would see her hands trembling as she drew the small velvet pouch from beneath her cloak. "Your mother's pearls," said Mr. Ibbotson, turning the strand beneath his loop with the unhurried cruelty of a man who had priced 1,000 griefs before hers. "A fine clasp. Georgian, I'd wager. Sentimental value, I imagine." "I have no use for sentiment this week," Elinor said, and was proud that her voice did not break. "I have use for £30. He offered 22. She took it, because £22 was the difference between her brother eating supper and her brother going without, and because pride, she had learned in the 11 months since her father's death, was a luxury reserved for women who did not owe money to men with hard eyes and harder ledgers. She walked home through streets just beginning to wake, the coins a cold weight in her glove, and told herself this was the last time. She had told herself that after the garnet brooch. She had told herself that after her grandmother's ring. She was beginning to understand that in her family's particular arithmetic of ruin, there was always one more last time. Sir Edmund Hartley had been a kind man, a foolish man, and in the end a dead man, and he had left behind him a legacy of debts so tangled that even his own solicitor wept quietly over the ledgers. He had left behind a wife too frail to be told the truth of it, a boy of 12 who still believed his father a hero, a girl of 9 who cried for a father she barely remembered, and a daughter of 22 who had inherited, in place of a dowry, the terrible privilege of holding her family together with her own 2 hands. Elinor had never asked for that privilege. She had simply picked it up, the way one picks up a dropped candle before the whole house can catch fire, because there had been no one else standing close enough to do it. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined, walking home with her mother's pearls turned to 22 cold pounds in her glove, was that somewhere across the city, in a house of grey stone and colder silence, a man was already at work, undoing the very ruin she was breaking herself to survive. He would not have called it kindness. He rarely called anything by its gentle name. His household called him the Ice Duke of Rothmere, and they did not say it unkindly, only truthfully, the way one might remark upon weather that never changed. Gideon Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Rothmere, had not smiled at a dinner in 4 years. He had not danced since the winter his brother died. He conducted his correspondence before dawn, rode alone in weather that kept sensible men indoors, and was known throughout Mayfair to possess a heart, if he possessed one at all, carved from the same grey stone as his ancestral house. What Mayfair did not know, what almost no one living knew, was that twice a month, under a name that was not his own, the Duke of Rothmere purchased debts from moneylenders across London the way other men purchased horses. Quietly, without haggling that drew attention. Without ever once attaching his name to the transaction. He had been doing it for 3 years. He had never met a single family he saved. He preferred it that way. Gratitude, in his experience, was a debt of its own, and he had buried enough people who owed him gratitude to want no more of it. But when his solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, laid before him a list of outstanding accounts belonging to the late Sir Edmund Hartley, the Duke's pen stopped moving for the first time in 3 years of quiet philanthropy. "Hartley," he said, very low. "You knew him, Your Grace?" The Duke did not answer for a long moment. He was remembering a night 11 years gone, a flooded river, a boy of 19 who could not swim, and a man twice his age who had gone into black water without a thought for his own life to pull him out. He was remembering that the man who had saved him had asked for nothing afterward, not money, not favor, not even his name spoken aloud in company, only that Gideon go home and stop trying to prove to his father that he could outrun grief on horseback in the dark. "I knew him," the Duke said finally. buy every debt, quietly, all of it, and Pemberton, if a single soul learns whose money settles it, you will answer to me personally. He did not tell his solicitor the rest of what he was thinking, because he did not fully understand it himself, that somewhere in that family, unknown to him, there might be a daughter now shouldering what should never have been hers to carry, and that some old, unexamined thing in his chest had gone taut at the thought of it, like a rope pulled suddenly straight. He told himself it was only debt of honor repaid. He was not yet ready to call it anything else. The debts began disappearing before Elinor understood they were disappearing. It was Thomas who noticed first, because Thomas noticed everything a boy of 12 notices when he is trying very hard to be the man of the house and has not yet learned that men are permitted not to understand things. The butcher didn't ask for the account today, he told her over a thin supper of barley soup. He just wrote something in his book and said good day. He was likely distracted, Elinor said, though something in her chest had gone cold and alert, like a hare hearing a hawk's shadow cross the grass. Then it was the landlord who did not call for the quarter's rent. Then it was a letter from her father's solicitor, brief and strange, informing her that the mortgage upon the small remaining acreage at Hartley Cross had been satisfied in full by prior arrangement, with no further explanation offered, and, when she wrote back demanding one, none given. She did not trust it. She had learned, in 11 months of widowhood by proxy, that unexplained mercy from the world usually concealed a trap, a scandal, or a bill twice as large, arriving later with interest. She lay awake, turning the mystery over like a coin that might yet prove counterfeit, and told her mother nothing, because her mother's heart was too weak for either despair or hope administered too suddenly. She kept selling what remained to sell, because a mystery she did not understand was not a foundation upon which to stop protecting her family. She sold her second-best gown for cutting into a new one for Grace. She sold the small gilt clock from the drawing-room mantel, the one that had chimed through every Christmas of her childhood, and told herself it was only a clock, and cried about it anyway, alone, in the cold larder where no one could hear her. It was in this state, raw-eyed, proud, and utterly unprepared, that she was offered the position that would deliver her, without warning, into the very house of the man who was quietly saving her family and asking nothing in return. Mrs. Pargeter, her father's old friend, and the only member of society who still called upon the Hartleys with any regularity, arrived one wet Tuesday with an offer that Elinor's pride wished to refuse, and her circumstances would not permit her to. The Duke of Rothmere requires someone to catalogue his late mother's portrait gallery and correspondence before the collection is sent to auction, Mrs. Pargeter said, settling her ample self into the one good chair remaining in the Hartley drawing-room. His man of business approached me, knowing I moved once in scholarly circles. I am too old and too blind for close work now. But you, my dear, you have your father's eye for history, and God knows you could use the wage. I have heard of the Duke, Elinor said carefully. They call him many things, none of them warm, Mrs. Pargeter said. But his money spends the same as a warmer man's, and you will scarcely see him. He keeps to his study and his ledgers, and leaves the running of the house to Mrs. Fenn. 6 weeks' work, decent pay, and no scandal attached to a respectable occupation of the mind. What have you to lose? What she had to lose, Elinor thought later, packing her one good black dress and her father's old spectacles for close work, was rather more than she yet understood. But hunger has its own persuasive logic, and within the week she was standing before the iron gates of Rothmere House, with her chin lifted and her hands, beneath her gloves, trembling only a little. The house received her the way a mountain receives weather, indifferent, immense, and entirely unmoved by her arrival. Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, was not unkind but was economical with warmth, as though she had learned it from her master. She led Elinor through corridors hung with portraits of Ashcombs long dead, their painted eyes following her with the particular disdain of the deceased aristocracy for the temporarily employed. His Grace keeps to the east wing, Mrs. Fenn said, as if this were both instruction and warning. "You'll work in the long gallery. He does not care to be disturbed, and I'd advise you not to disturb him." "I have no wish to disturb anyone," Elinor said. "I wish only to work and be paid for it." Something in Mrs. Fenn's face softened very slightly, the way stone softens under years of rain. Well, that's more sense than most who come through that door with wishes of their own." For 3 days, Elinor did not see the Duke at all, and was glad of it. She lost herself instead in the gallery's cool northern light and the late Duchess's correspondence, a woman who had apparently been witty, beloved, and dead these past 15 years, survived by a husband and 2 sons, one of whom, she gathered from the household's careful clipped references, had died some years before under circumstances no one wished to discuss above a whisper. She was cataloguing a portrait of 2 boys on horseback, one perhaps 10, one perhaps 7, both grinning with the reckless joy of children who do not yet know that joy is not permanent, when she became aware that she was no longer alone in the gallery. She turned and found herself looking at the Ice Duke of Rothmere for the first time. He was younger than she expected, and colder than she had been warned. Tall, dark-haired, dressed with the severe plainness of a man who considered fashion an indulgence he had outgrown. His eyes, when they met hers, held the particular stillness of a lake in winter, not empty, she thought, but frozen very deliberately over something that ran deep. "You are the Hartley girl," he said. It was not a question. "Elinor Hartley, Your Grace." She rose and curtsied, and was irritated with herself for the flutter of nerves it cost her. "I did not mean to keep the room past its hour. I had lost track of time. That is what this gallery does to people," he said, and something in his voice, not warmth precisely, but the ghost of it, made her look at him more closely. His gaze had gone to the portrait behind her, the 2 boys on horseback, and for the briefest instant, his composure cracked along some old invisible fault line before sealing itself shut again. "You will find my mother's letters occupy several trunks. Take whatever time you require. I have no wish for haste to ruin what should be done with care." It was such a small kindness, buried in such careful indifference, that Elinor almost missed it entirely. She would think of it again, later, and recognize it for what it was, the first sign that the Ice Duke of Rothmere was not, in fact, made only of ice. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I will treat them gently." "See that you do," he said, and was gone before she could decide whether his tone had been an order or, absurdly, something closer to a request. The days that followed built themselves quietly, the way frost builds on a window, so slowly that one does not notice the change until the whole pane has transformed. The Duke did not seek her out exactly, but he passed through the gallery more often than the running of a great house strictly required, and Elinor began to notice things about him that his reputation had not prepared her for. She noticed that he was gentle with the old spaniel who slept by the gallery hearth, though he pretended not to notice the animal at all. She noticed that when a young footman dropped and shattered a Sèvres vase worth more than the boy's yearly wage, the Duke's only comment was a quiet instruction to Mrs. Fenn that the matter be forgotten and the boy's wages left untouched. She noticed that he stood before his brother's portrait some evenings for a long time, saying nothing, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with dukedoms or ledgers. "You mustn't mind his Grace's manner," said Mrs. Fenn one afternoon, finding Elinor watching him disappear down the corridor after one such silence. "He wasn't always so shut up in himself. Lost his younger brother, Master Peter, some 6 years past. Debts, drink, despair. It all came on the boy so fast, none of us saw the end of it coming until it had already come. His Grace was from home when it happened. Blames himself for it still, though there was naught he could have done, and God knows he's tried since to make up for a debt that was never his to pay." Elinor said nothing, but something in her chest turned over, unbidden and unwelcome, a tenderness she had not asked for and did not entirely want. It was easier, she thought, to hold a house together when one did not have to consider that the cold, forbidding men of the world carried their own private ruins, quietly, the way she carried hers. She did not yet understand how closely his ruin and her survival had come to touch. Their conversations, when they occurred, began as small collisions rather than exchanges. Two people, each guarding a private grief, testing the ground between them with the caution of soldiers crossing a field that might yet be mined. He found her one evening still working by candlelight, long past the hour she ought to have retired, transcribing a letter in the late Duchess's elegant, slanting hand. "You work too late," he said, from the doorway, in the tone of a man remarking on weather. "I had rather finish a task than leave it half done, Your Grace." An admirable philosophy. An exhausting one. He came further into the room, and for once did not immediately retreat to safer ground. "What is it you are reading, that it keeps you from your bed?" "Your mother's letter to a Mrs. Aldous, dated some 20 years past. She writes of her sons with such tenderness, it is difficult not to linger over it." Elinor hesitated, then added, because something in his stillness invited a boldness she would not ordinarily have claimed. "She writes here that Peter laughed so hard at his own joke, he fell from his pony and refused, out of pride, to be helped up by anyone but you." She watched the words land on him like a struck bell, the sound traveling somewhere deep before it faded. For a moment, she thought she had gone too far, trespassed on ground Mrs. Fenn had warned her to leave untouched. "He did," the Duke said at last, very quietly. "He always did prefer to be helped up by no one, and by me particularly, as if I alone did not count as being helped at all." He looked at the letter in her hands, as though it were a window into a room he had locked years ago and nearly forgotten how to open. "You may keep the letter aside. I should like to read it myself, when you are done with your work." "Of course, Your Grace." "Gideon," he said, and then seemed almost startled by his own offering, as if the name had slipped free before his customary reserve could catch it. "When we are not in company, I find—" He stopped, visibly retreating, and the frost reassembled itself across his features with the speed of long practice. "Forgive me, that was inappropriate." "I did not find it so," Elinor said softly, and did not examine too closely why her heart had begun to beat a little faster, or why she found herself hoping, against every instinct of caution she possessed, that he would not take the offering back. He did not take it back, though he did not repeat it often. But something between them had shifted, quietly, the way a key turns almost silently in a well-oiled lock, and neither of them, in that moment, was yet prepared to ask what door it opened. It was a fortnight later that the second revelation arrived, delivered not by the Duke, but by circumstance, in the person of Elinor's Aunt Beatrice, who descended upon the Hartley household like a cold front sweeping in off the sea. "You cannot continue in that man's employ," her aunt announced, settling into the drawing-room with the particular authority of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own correctness. "It is unseemly. A young, unmarried woman, alone in a bachelor duke's house for weeks at a stretch. Do you imagine society will forgive you the appearance of it, whatever the reality?" "I imagine society may say what it likes," Elinor said. "The wage feeds my brother and sister. I have not the luxury of unseemliness as a concern above hunger." "Then let me offer you a solution to both." Her aunt's smile had the warmth of a closed door. "Mr. Josiah Pruitt has expressed an interest in you. He is not a romantic figure, I grant you, but he is a wealthy one, and he is prepared to settle your family's remaining debts entirely upon your acceptance of his suit." Elinor's stomach turned cold. She had met Mr. Pruitt twice, a widower of 55 with damp hands and a way of looking at young women that made her skin crawl beneath her sleeves. "I would rather sell every possession I own to the last handkerchief than marry that man." "Then perhaps you ought to consider," her aunt said, with the particular cruelty of relatives who mistake honesty for wisdom, "that your family's remaining debts do not in fact appear to require settling. Someone appears already to be paying them. I confess I had wondered whether your position at Rothmere House was rather more generously compensated than a mere cataloguing wage ought to allow." The implication landed like a slap. "I have taken nothing from the Duke but honest wages for honest work," Elinor said, Her voice shaking with fury, she fought to master. "I do not know who has settled our debts, and I resent bitterly the suggestion that I have purchased mercy with anything but my own labor." "Then I suggest you discover the truth of it," her aunt said, rising to leave, "before the rest of society draws its own conclusions, as it is already beginning to do." Elinor sat alone for a long time after her aunt's carriage had departed, her hands pressed together to still their trembling, and understood with sudden, sick clarity that the mystery she had been too proud and too frightened to investigate had become a weapon that could be turned against her reputation, her family's name, and everything she had bled herself dry to protect. She resolved, that night, to learn the truth, not for her own comfort, but because she could no longer afford the luxury of not knowing. The opportunity came sooner than she expected, and from a source she had not anticipated. Mr. Pemberton, the Duke's solicitor, arrived at Rothmere House the following week to review certain accounts with his employer, and in the particular carelessness of men who assume young women cataloguing letters are not attending to the business conducted around them, left a ledger open upon the study table while he stepped briefly from the room. Elinor told herself she should not look. She looked anyway, because 11 months of holding a family together on will alone had taught her that propriety was a currency she could not always afford to spend, and because her own name, glimpsed at the top of a column of figures, had stopped her breath entirely. Hartley, debts satisfied in full. Purchaser, G.A., private account, G.A., Gideon Ashcombe. She closed the ledger with hands that would not quite obey her, and stood in the center of the study, feeling as though the floor beneath her had quietly, without warning, become a different floor entirely, one she did not know how to stand upon. He had paid everything. Not merely the mortgage, not merely one debt among many, but every account, every creditor, every last shilling of ruin her father had left behind him, settled in silence by a man who had never once mentioned it to her, who had watched her sell her jewelry piece by piece across the very weeks he had already erased the need for it. She did not know whether to weep with gratitude or burn with humiliation, and in the end she felt both at once, so violently that she had to grip the edge of the table to keep her legs beneath her. Why had he done it? Why had he said nothing? Had he been watching her all along, cataloguing her poverty the way she catalogued his mother's letters, allowing her to believe herself the architect of her own survival while he quietly rendered her efforts unnecessary? Had he pitied her? The thought was unbearable. She had built her entire remaining dignity upon the belief that, whatever else had been taken from her family, her own labor and her own choices remained hers, unbought and unbeholden. If he had paid her family's debts, then every pound she had wrung from her own jewelry, every humiliation swallowed at Mr. Ibbotson's counter, every night spent calculating and recalculating a ledger that had, unknown to her, already balanced itself. All of it had been theater performed for no audience but her own pride. She found him that evening in the library and did not wait for propriety to arrange her words for her. "You paid my father's debts," she said, before he had even risen from his chair. "All of them, months ago." The Duke went very still. She watched him consider, for one unguarded moment, whether to deny it, and watched him decide, with visible reluctance, that he would not lie to her. "Yes," he said quietly. "Why?" "Your father saved my life," he said. 11 years ago, in a river, I ought not to have been foolish enough to enter. He asked nothing of me for it, not then, not ever, and I have spent every year since wondering how I might repay a debt the man himself refused to let me acknowledge. When I learned of his death, and of what he had left behind him, it seemed the smallest and least sufficient of gestures to see it settled. And you said nothing to me. You let me believe." Her voice broke, and she hated it for breaking. "You let me sell my mother's pearls, Your Grace, believing every pound mattered, believing I was the one holding my family together, when in truth, you had already—" She could not finish the sentence. The humiliation of it closed her throat. "I did not tell you," he said, "because I did not want your gratitude. I did not want to be, in your eyes, a benefactor to be thanked, rather than a man to be—" He stopped himself, and something raw moved across his face before he mastered it. I did not want it to change what was growing between us into something owed rather than something chosen. I have watched enough gratitude curdle into obligation to know I did not want that for you, for us. You had no right, Elinor said, and the words came out shaking with an anger that was, she realized even as she spoke it, only grief wearing anger's clothing, to decide for me what I was permitted to know about my own life. I gave up pieces of my mother, believing I had no other choice. You took that choice from me without ever once asking whether I wished it taken. I know, he said, and to her astonishment, his composure, that careful frozen surface he wore like armor, cracked entirely. I know it, and I am sorry for it, and I would not undo the debts, but I would undo the silence if I could. I did not think. I have grown so unaccustomed to being known that I forgot what it costs another person not to be trusted with the truth. They stood in silence for a long moment, the fire cracking softly in the grate, both of them aware that something fragile and unnamed had just been struck a blow it might not survive. I require time, Your Grace, Elinor said at last, very quietly. I cannot think clearly with gratitude and anger occupying the same room in my chest. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will not press you. I have pressed enough people into silence in my life without meaning to. I would not have you among them. She left the library with her eyes burning and her thoughts in ruins, and did not yet know that the true test of what lay between them was still to come. She withdrew, in the days that followed, into a careful, wounded formality that the Duke did not attempt to breach. She completed her cataloguing with mechanical precision, spoke to him only of portraits and correspondence, and told herself that this was wisdom rather than cowardice, that a woman who had spent a year learning not to trust unearned mercy was right to be cautious of a man who had proven himself capable of profound, secret generosity and equally profound, secret concealment. But grief, she was discovering, does not remain where one attempts to store it. It leaks. It surfaces in unguarded moments, in the particular ache she felt watching him stand before his brother's portrait, in the way her chest tightened when Mrs. Fenn mentioned, in passing, that His Grace had eaten almost nothing since the evening in the library, in the treacherous, persistent memory of his voice saying, I did not want it to change what was growing between us, as though something had, in fact, been growing, tender and unacknowledged, in the frozen ground between two wounded people. It was Thomas, of all people, who forced the reckoning she had been avoiding. Her brother arrived unannounced at Rothmere House, having walked the 3 miles from home alone and without permission, his face pale with an urgency that stopped Elinor's heart before he even spoke. Mamma has taken ill, he said, breathless. Dr. Wren says it is her heart. He says, Elinor, he says we must send for you at once. She was in the carriage within the quarter hour, the Duke himself having ordered it readied before she had even finished asking, and it was in the swaying dark of that carriage, her brother's cold hand clutched in hers, that Elinor understood with sudden, terrible clarity how thin the membrane was between the life she had built and the ruin that had always waited beneath it, and how little any of her pride, her anger, her careful withdrawal mattered against the plain fact of a life she loved, hanging by a thread. Her mother lived, but the physician's verdict, delivered in the small hours of the morning while Elinor sat white-faced in the corridor, was that Mrs. Hartley's heart had been weakened beyond full recovery, and that any further strain, any further shock, grief or want, might prove fatal. Elinor sat with that verdict alone in the dark, and felt the last of her pride finally, quietly, give way. She had nearly lost her mother that night. She had come within an hour, perhaps less, of losing the last parent she had, while she occupied herself with the fine architecture of her own wounded dignity. And somewhere across the city, a man who had already once saved her family without asking for thanks, had sent his own physician, his own carriage, his own household into motion, within minutes of learning she was needed, without once demanding to be told why, without once making his help conditional upon her forgiveness. She thought of her father, going into black water for a stranger's son and asking nothing in return. She thought of the Duke, standing before his brother's portrait with a grief he had never learned to set down. She thought of how very alike they were, these two men she had loved without meaning to. One gone, one still waiting, both of them teaching her, in their different ways, that the truest generosity asks for nothing, not even gratitude, not even understanding. She rose before dawn and went to find him. She found him in the stables of all places, seeing personally to the horse that had carried her home in the night, his sleeves rolled and his hands gentle upon the animal's flank, in a manner entirely unlike the cold Duke society believed him to be. "You did not have to come yourself," she said. "You might have sent a groom." "I wished to know the horse had not been overtaxed," he said, not turning. "And I confess I wished to be near enough to hear, the moment word came, whether your mother—" He stopped, and she saw, with an ache that undid the last of her defenses, that his hands had gone still upon the horse's flank, and that whatever composure he still wore was costing him a great deal to maintain. "She will live," Elinor said, weakened, but living. He closed his eyes briefly, and something in his shoulders eased, as though a weight he had not permitted himself to name had been lifted. "I am glad of it, more glad than I have words to offer." "Gideon," she said, and watched his eyes open at the sound of his own name, offered back to him deliberately this time, not slipped free by accident. "I have been unjust to you. I was so determined to keep some small territory of my own suffering unpurchased, unbought, entirely mine, that I forgot to ask what it must have cost you to watch me suffer and say nothing, when saying something might have eased it in a moment." "It cost a great deal," he admitted. "More than I expected. I have grown accustomed, since my brother's death, to keeping every tender thing locked away, where it cannot be taken from me again. It was easier to save your family in silence than to risk offering you the truth and watching you refuse both the gift and the man who gave it." "I am not refusing either," Elinor said, and felt her own voice shake with the enormity of what she was choosing to say. "I was afraid, Your Grace, Gideon, that if I accepted your kindness, I would lose the last thing I had left that was entirely my own. But I understand now that you were never trying to take anything from me. You were trying, in the only language you still trusted, to give me something you could not bear to see me go without. I love you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him everything and nothing at once, as though he had been holding them so long that their release was both an agony and a relief. "I have loved you, I think, since the evening you told me of my brother falling from his pony and refusing help from anyone but me. I did not intend to. I had sworn, after Peter, that I would permit no one close enough to be lost again. But you came into this house and saw the wound beneath the ice before I had even shown it to you, and I found I could not go on pretending, in your presence, to be as cold as everyone else believed me. I love you," Elinor said, and the words, once spoken, seemed to loosen something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the morning she first sold her mother's pearls. "I think I have loved you since you told me to take whatever time I required with your mother's letters, as though care taken with the dead mattered more to you than haste convenient to the living. I did not expect to find tenderness inside a man the world called ice. I am glad I was wrong to expect otherwise." He crossed the small distance of the stable between them and took her hands in his, gently, as though she were something rare he had long ago given up hoping to hold. "I cannot promise you an easy life," he said. "My name carries scrutiny, my house carries old grief, and society will have opinions about a duke who marries his cataloguer that I cannot entirely shield you from. But I can promise you this: I will never again keep from you a truth that is rightfully yours to know, however much easier the silence might seem in the moment. You will never again wonder, in my house, whether you are believed or doubted, valued or merely tolerated. Whatever debts remain between us, Elinor, let them be debts of love, freely given and freely returned, and not one more ledger you must balance alone." "Then I accept your terms, Your Grace," she said, smiling through tears she no longer troubled to hide, "on the single condition that you learn to call me by my given name as easily as I have learned to call you by yours." "Elinor," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all, only the quiet certainty of a man who had finally, after long years in the cold, found something worth thawing for. Word of the engagement moved through society with the particular violence reserved for scandals too delicious to resist, and Aunt Beatrice, true to her nature, was among the first to attempt its destruction. She called upon the Duke directly, a boldness few possessed, and delivered her objections with the icy certainty of a woman who had never once considered that her nephew-in-law-to-be might no longer be the frozen figure society believed him. "You cannot seriously intend to marry a girl of no fortune and questionable circumstance," she said, "when half of London already whispers that she purchased your favor with more than honest labor." "Half of London," the Duke said, in a voice so quiet and so absolutely final that even Aunt Beatrice felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees, "may whisper whatever it likes. I intend to marry Miss Hartley because she is the only person in a decade who has looked upon my grief and seen a man rather than a title, and because her own conduct throughout this affair has shown more honor than I have witnessed in half the drawing rooms of this city combined. If you repeat your insinuation regarding her circumstances in any company whatsoever, Lady Renfield, you will discover that my reputation for coldness extends considerably further than my grief. It extends, I assure you, to my memory of exactly who has slighted the woman I intend to marry, and how thoroughly I am capable of ensuring such persons find themselves unwelcome in every house that values my continued acquaintance." Aunt Beatrice departed, considerably paler than she had arrived, and did not trouble the Hartley family again. The wedding, when it came, was a quiet one, held not in the grand fashion society expected of a duke, but in the small stone chapel at Rothmere, with Elinor's mother seated in a chair near the front, her colour better than it had been in months, and Thomas and Grace standing solemn and proud beside their sister as she walked toward a man who had once saved her family in silence and now stood ready to build a life with her in the open. "You once told me," Elinor said to him quietly, as they stood together afterward in the long gallery where she had first catalogued his mother's letters, surrounded now by portraits of Ashcombs who had lived and loved and grieved long before either of them were born, "that this room did something to people. I did not understand then what you meant." "I meant," Gideon said, drawing her hand into his, "that it is a room built to hold the whole of a family's history, its griefs as much as its joys, its ruins as much as its restorations. I did not know when I said it that I was also describing what you would come to do for me. You did not simply catalogue my mother's letters, Elinor. You catalogued the parts of me I had long ago locked away, and you did it with such care that I began to hope, for the first time since Peter's death, that some part of me was still worth restoring. And you," she said, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light of evening fell gold across the portraits of the dead, who had, in their own quiet way, made this reunion possible, gave me back the one thing I thought I had lost forever, the day I sold my mother's pearls. Not the pearls themselves, but the belief that mercy in this world is sometimes offered without any hidden cost at all, freely, quietly, by people who ask for nothing but the chance to love well. Outside, the last carriages of well-wishers rolled away down the long drive, and the great house of Rothmere, once known throughout the county for its silence and its cold, settled instead into something it had not known in a very long time, the particular, unmistakable warmth of a family beginning again. In the years that followed, the story of the Ice Duke and the jeweller's daughter softened, as such stories do, into something closer to legend than gossip, told at dinner tables not as scandal, but as romance, the tale of a woman who had sold every ornament she owned to save her family, never knowing that the very debts she fought so hard against had already been quietly erased by a man too proud and too wounded to ask for thanks. But those who knew them best understood that the truest part of the story was never the debts paid nor the pearls sold, but the slower, harder miracle that came after. Two people, each convinced their own capacity for love had been buried beyond recovery, teaching each other, patiently and honestly, how to be known again. And on quiet evenings, when the household had long since retired and the great gallery stood empty but for candlelight and portraits, the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere could sometimes be found there still, her hand in his, reading old letters together, adding, in their own turn, new chapters to a family history that had once nearly ended in silence, and instead, because of a debt honored and a heart finally unguarded, went on,